all here, thank you so much for coming out to support the honors program and to support our fabulous presenter today, Caleb Smith. I'm Dr. Cook. I'm the coordinator of the honors program. We've been having honors capstone presentations every day this week. This is our last one for the semester. We're super proud of our honors graduates and their hard work. The capstone presentation represents at least one semester's work. Sometimes it's been a project that's lasted longer than a semester. So I want to be sure to thank Professor Daryl Castillo, who was Caleb's mentor for this project. A lot of time, effort, and energy that our mentors give to our students, and we're very appreciative of that. So without further ado, I want to get out of the way. I'd like to introduce to you, Caleb Smith, presenting over Hitler, an attractive leader until February 1943, after which he was no longer an attractive leader.
So I realized the title's a little bit of a mouthful. I tried to change it was too late. So today I'm going to tell you why Hitler wasn't just tolerated, but loved as the leader of Germany, especially in the beginning, until February of 1943. So why is it important that we talk about this, that we know these things? So the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis during World War II are some of the most heinous in our remembered history, and these happened less than 100 years ago. Yet it seems to me that not enough people really understand what happened then. This presentation will cover only a small aspect of the bigger picture, but I hope to pique your interest in the subject. Winston Churchill said that if those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And that, from my experience, seems to be true. So I'm going to start with Hitler's early life. Now, his childhood was not remarkable or abnormal in any particular way that made it clear what was going to happen. He loved his mom, he respected his dad, he went to public school, and just nothing of import really happened then that turned him into what he became, the monster he eventually became. He was born in Austria, so not actually born in Germany, on 4/20 of 1889. And he spent his early 20s in Vienna, in the capital of Austria. He was a failed artist. He liked to paint landscapes. No one was really buying. And he was a vagabond. He stayed in communal housing. He had nothing of his own, really. But what he did do in Vienna was he watched the politics. He paid attention. He learned his political cunning in this city in his early 20s. So in Vienna, you had the pan-German nationalists, and you had the smaller tribes, the Slavs and the Czechs in particular, but these smaller tribes that were fighting for their own rights against these nationalist parties. So Hitler watched all this. He thought that these smaller tribes fighting for this was sort of an affront to German authority and German superiority, and he believed that this should be suppressed with force if necessary. He thought it was an affront. And this is where he formed his core beliefs and all of that. So in 1914, World War II began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and Hitler joined the German army. And by all accounts, he was a good soldier. He was well respected. He was awarded the Iron Cross second and first class. And in 1918, he was injured in a British gas attack in Belgium. Now, while he's recovering from this gas attack, the war ends. And it ends without any real surrender by the German military. It's just an armistice was signed, a ceasefire. And so this would come into play in Hitler's politics. So this German military, a nation that is traditionally very prideful of their military, has just been defeated without ever surrendering. So because of this, he felt betrayed by those in power. So the German Kaiser Wilhelm II and his aristocracy. And as I said, this will come into play in his politics later. So in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is written up and signed. Now this treaty is different from the armistice. It's a separate document, and it was supposed to officially end the war. It was also supposed to guarantee peace for the foreseeable future. It did not achieve that. All it really achieved was crippling Germany and embarrassing them. So it fostered all this hatred and motivation for revenge that would come in the form of World War II, particularly among the German soldiers that were just betrayed by the Kaiser. So I'm going to go over a few of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. So one of them was a restricted military. So they just got done fighting this war with millions of soldiers. And because of this treaty, this military is now restricted to 100,000 volunteers. So they can't even pay their soldiers. Nor can the Navy build vessels that are over 10 tons. So traditionally militaristic nation now has no military. They were saddled with reparations that they had to pay their enemies in the war. 132 billion gold marks. In today's money, in US dollars, that's $605 billion, which might not seem like a lot now, but it's a lot back then. And this caused Germany to have to go into debt to many different nations, us included, and was a huge hit to their economy. And arguably the most embarrassing part of this for them, the part that hurt their pride the most, was the cessation of territories that they had won during the war, and some that had nothing to do with the war. There was a few in Belgium and Denmark and the Netherlands and France, but the main one would be the Danzig Corridor. Now, this is not territory that Germany conquered during the war. It is, the Treaty of Versailles granted the Polish a country of their own. And this country had to have access to the sea, and this corridor gave them access to the sea. It also split Germany into two parts. A once unified nation is now split in two because of this treaty and because of this land that they're having to give away. And the Germans had no love for the Polish. That was very racially motivated, but it was a slap in the face for that reason as well. Now, this treaty created an environment of extreme poverty and uncertainty and instability, and gave birth to the Weimar Republic, which is the period in Germany after World War I and before Hitler came into power, which was 1933. And so this was instrumental in creating the power vacuum that Hitler occupied. Now, the Beer Hall Putsch is an important event that happened in Hitler's rise to power. It was a failed Nazi coup in 1923. He took roughly 2,000 Nazis and marched on the Reichstag, which is the government building in Munich, in Bavaria, on the southernmost part of Germany. He was unsuccessful. There were some cops waiting at the Reichstag, and they fired into the crowd. They actually gut shot the guy standing next to Hitler. He died. And Hitler was on the run for 2 days before they captured him. Now, when they captured him, they wanted to make an example of him as a traitor. And so they put him on trial, a very public trial. This backfired because Hitler was a very gifted orator. And so now he has this public platform that he would not have otherwise had, and he can reach way more people than he ever thought he could. And so he's sentenced to 5 years for treason. He only served 9 months, during which he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, his famous book. And once that was published, that's put into circulation. Now he's got even more followers. So it was a domino effect after this trial of him gaining support. Now, the Weimar Republic would still be around for 10 more years after this. But in 1933, Hitler is granted the chancellery. And this is where the world is watching, right? In the first year of Hitler being in power, unemployment went down from 20% to 16%, which might not seem like a lot, pretty impressive for 1 year. So the Weimar Republic had gone through the Great Depression. Things were really bad. It was 6 million out of 30 million people were not employed, which is a huge number. And in the first year of Hitler being in power, that went to 4.8 million. Also, there is a lot of investment in infrastructure, so electricity, municipalities, roads. Rearmament was one of them, which I'll get into rearmament more. And engineering, R&D. It's just creating jobs. It's fixing their economy. It's creating, high quality German goods that are being exported. The recovery of the German economy after the Great Depression is miraculous in a lot of ways. And the world, before the wars broke out, the world loved Hitler for it. They thought it was incredible. So, rearmament. I want to talk about that in particular because because of the lost pride from the loss of the German military. This is important. So he started building the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, which Germany would use to dominate the first part of World War II, absolutely dominate. He started building the Navy, namely the U-boats, the Untersee boats, which were these high-tech submarines that the Germans were making. To quote Churchill again, he actually said that this is the only thing that he was afraid of through the whole war. After America joined, after all of that, they dominated the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean, during World War II. Up until the end, they dominated. And yeah, just more investment into engineering, especially military weapons and such. And this is why, even today, German engineering is synonymous with like quality and, you got your Audis, your BMWs, your Mercedes, people love it. In 1935, he introduced conscription, which is a blatant disregard of the Treaty of Versailles. So now he's bolstering his ranks. The 100,000 rule is no longer a thing, but the other nations, afraid of another war, kind of let him do this. He did it in secret at first, but something like that doesn't stay secret. And so this is all endearing Hitler to his people because he's actually doing work. He's improving the lives of these people, of his constituents. So getting off of that for a little bit, can't talk about Hitler without talking about some fascism. So just for a brief definition of fascism, it's the far-right, ultranationalist dictatorship that will push for a centralized or militarized state, right, government. And so it's kind of it's communism's slightly capitalist cousin. But Hitler used fascism to his advantage. One tool that the fascists like to use is an us versus them kind of environment. So for Germany, the us would have been the middle to lower class Germans, and the them would have been the communists, not the Jews as one might think. But he was able to heavily associate the Jews with the communists and the social democrats and people of that thinking. And the way he was able to do that is the Jews were able to weather the Great Depression really well. So I'll go into a little different history here. Hitler wouldn't have been able to do what he did to the Jews without a tradition of anti-Semitism already kind of in place. So the Jews rejected Jesus Christ as the Messiah. So because of this, for 2,000 years, they're pushed out of wherever they're at. So even up until this time, it was very rare to find a Jewish landowner. But what you did have is Jews that were good at commerce and being merchants and banking and stuff that made them a lot of money without having to own a lot of land, without having to set roots down. So if you're a German landowner who just went through the Great Depression and the Weimar Republic, you have no money left, you were starving for a time, and you watched your Jewish neighbors weather it gracefully because they have assets that aren't going down in price. They have gold and jewels and nice houses and stuff like that. And so Hitler is able to turn this into the Jews are associated with, they are the communists and the social democrats that are trying to take advantage of the broken state of the German nation to obtain ultimate control. Which is, it's a farce, right? But that's how he was able to do that. Another thing I want to touch on is the stab in the back doctrine. So this is the notion that the signing of the armistice at World War I and the Treaty of Versailles was done behind the backs of the German military and their soldiers, done by the Kaiser Wilhelm and his cronies, essentially. So it creates a sense of, the government's out to get you, they're not doing the best for you, here I come, I'm going to save you from that. So just another way of endearing the people to him. It's all propaganda. It's worth noting that the final decision to sign those documents was made by the German military, the commanders of the German military. So another tool used by fascists is the mythic past. So this is a glorification of the past of a nation, right? You can see stuff like both of these ideas today if you look hard enough. So with Germany, it would have been, a glorification of the Habsburg Empire, which this map is of that. They had a lot of different places they were ruling at the time. Now, Hitler was saying that, this was the ideal time to be a German. The Habsburg it was a brutal time. It was the 1700s. It's brutal for anybody. In what way was this better? That's not really, that's the propaganda, right? Fun little fact, the Habsburgs have like an incest trait of a Habsburg chin, if you want to look that up. That's still seen today. But neither here nor there, sorry. So also the Germans had a lot of military feats that they went through a lot in the 1800s for sure, that Hitler would harken back to and be like, look what we used to be, we can be that again, that kind of rhetoric. And this mixed with, insane amounts of propaganda creates this thing for German people to strive to try to accomplish that's not only unrealistic but unobtainable. But if you don't know any better, it sounds good. So this is kind of the propaganda side of how Hitler was able to get everyone to love him, while on the side doing all these horrible things. So another aspect of this would be when World War II started, there was a lot of success on the side of the Germans. So I won't go into too many specifics here, but in 1939, September 1st, World War I starts with the invasion of Poland. The Germans steamrolled Poland. You can guess why they chose Poland to invade. They were splitting up the nation because of the Treaty of Versailles. So that happens in September of 1939. In 1940, the Germans start their Western offensive, and World War I was defined by the trench warfare. There was like 500 miles of trenches on the French and Belgian border. Hitler's army was able to prevent this by this right here. This is the Ardennes Forest. The Ardennes Forest was thought to be impassable by any sort of military caravan or anything like that, and they rolled right through it. But because it was thought to be impassable, the Allies went this way and just hung out here. So the Germans come to the Ardennes and encircled them, and then pushed them to Dunkirk, which is right there. So if you've ever heard of Dunkirk, this is where the Germans encircled all the Allied soldiers that were on the mainland Europe and pushed them off the continent. And they would not return until 1944, a year before the war ended, the Normandy landing. I say that. They landed in Italy, too, slightly before that. So Paris is taken in 6 weeks. In contrast to World War I, where they never really got very far into France, this is a huge deal. It took them a month and a half to take Paris. So now the Germans feel invincible, right? They can't believe how good they've done. No one can stand against them. It's worth noting that these soldiers were given something called Pervitin. Pervitin is an extremely refined form of methamphetamine, and they didn't have to sleep when they had this stuff. So imagine fighting an army that doesn't have to sleep. Can't win. So that's the Western Front. They got stopped in the Battle of Britain, but they weren't really focused on Britain anyway. They were focused more on taking out the communists. So now they start the Eastern Front, which is Operation Barbarossa. They started in 1941, and for the first year, they were virtually uncontested. They got to Moscow, they got to modern-day St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad then, and laid siege. But there was another army group that was going south. And this is where things kind of take a turn for the Nazis. So in July of 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad starts. So what's happening is there's an army group. This is just kind of like a layout of Stalingrad and what's happening in the area around it. But the German army was moving south to take oil fields here at the Caucasus Mountains, which is down here. And had they captured these oil fields, they might have actually won the war. But they didn't, because Hitler ordered them to go here, to Stalingrad. So there are strategic motives for him wanting to do this. A position on the Volga River, which the Allies were using to send aid to Russia and the Soviet Union. There were armament factories in Stalingrad that would have been an asset. But once they got there, well, let me say this. The German generals did not agree with this plan. They wanted to take the oil fields. But Hitler is the Führer, you know. So Hitler kind of turned these motives into something more petty. He kind of marketed them as taking a city that has the name of Stalin in it. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. He takes the city that is the namesake of the leader of the Soviet Union. That's a huge blow to the ego of Russia. So very egotistical motives being thrown around here. So they get to Stalingrad, they start fighting, and they get bogged down in this urban warfare, this horrible room-to-room fighting. And, you know, a little over 1 million Germans died, over 2 million Russians died, but the Russians had more people. And it was closer to home for them. They moved the factories out of Stalingrad and were able to just keep sending people and keep rearming. And they bogged the Germans down there to the point where they actually encircled them in November of 1942. And once this happened, the Germans couldn't get enough aid into this encircled German army that is in the city. So this army is starving. This army is being killed mostly by dysentery at this point, which if you don't know what dysentery is, it's diarrhea. And, you know, they're dying like flies. So they wanted to break out to the south. Hitler said, no, you got to stay and fight. And he promoted a guy named General Paulus to Field Marshal, which is like the highest promotion you can get in the German army. And he did that so that General Paulus would either fight to the death or kill himself without getting captured. General Paulus did not care that he was promoted to Field Marshal. He surrendered. His men were in horrible shape. He wasn't about to put them through that. So he surrendered and was actually a great prize to the Russians. He had a lot of, intel. And so that kind of completes the failing of Stalingrad with the surrender of General Paulus. Now, once this happened, so this was a very egotistical move on Hitler's part that failed. So it broke this dogma, this divine thing that he had going on. And his generals now questioned his orders. You know, they questioned his strategic prowess, his genius. And amongst just the soldiers, you know, rumors started happening. There was a rumor that he was a double that they were seeing, and the real Hitler was posted up in his Bavarian Alps place, his little chalet he had there. But this is sort of the accepted end to Hitler's, prestige. This ended in February 1943, thus the title. And after this, the war went on for 2 more years. The German generals weren't against the war, but they started to become against Hitler. But they still had to fight this war. So they still needed a leader. They still more or less did what he said. But it just now it was like, we really need to get out of this. We need to either win or stop. But it just never did. And eventually, Berlin's taken by the Russians and Hitler kills himself. But that's 2 years down the line. But this is the point I wanted to make, is this is the beginning of the end for Hitler. Why should we care about any of this? So the reason this is important is so that we understand that these atrocities that the Nazis committed, the Holocaust, and the mass executions that happened on the Eastern Front of the Ukrainians and the extermination camps in Poland, did not begin with evil and terror. It began with love. It began with people that were manipulated into believing this guy is the answer to their problems. So we need to understand that a nation of people can be manipulated. It's harder to manipulate an individual than it is a nation of people. And this can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be Germany that this happened in. This could happen again. So we should be able to identify the signs of something like this happening again. There is rhetoric that we can see today, if we look hard enough, that is similar, eerily similar to the stuff that happened in Nazi Germany. The main difference would be, this age of information that we live in makes it hard to have just propaganda thrown in your face and be like, all right, that's true. There's a lot of different avenues of information we can go down as people today. But if we can see the writing on the wall soon enough for something like this, maybe we can prevent it. and stop it before it gets to a point beyond our control. And here are my sources for my images. That's the end of my presentation. Now, we ended a lot sooner than I thought, so is there any questions?
Miss Valerie, you can go first.
Miss Valerie.
So, noticing Hitler born in 1889 in Vienna, which is Austria.
Well, he was born just across the Bavarian border. He wasn't born in Vienna, but he spent his early 20s there. But he was born in I can't remember the name of the town, but it was right across the border. It was in an inn, just across the border.
So he actually is born, because at that time in 1889, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is still a political viable entity,
Yes.
as opposed to Germany. So, yes, he's born in Germany but grows up in Vienna, but his identity is obviously very German.
Very much
He
German.
did not identify with Austro-Hungarian at all if he was so on the pan-German side. And so was his citizenship actually German, and that's why he was able to join the German army in World War I?
So it was less of, the borders of Germany and more of German speaking. So Austria spoke German. The Hungarians speak German. He had this idea of uniting, in the Third Reich, he wanted to unite all the German-speaking nations under the same Reich. That was his main goal. So his motives weren't really, his identity didn't have to do with necessarily the borders, but the language, if that makes sense. But, it was German language, Deutschland, is what he identified with, not necessarily Austria. He felt that Austria and Germany were the same. Anyone else? Dr. Castillo.
As an historical curiosity, I found it somewhat intellectually amusing from a morbid standpoint that Easter Sunday was Adolf Hitler's birthday.
Yeah.
Really? Okay, just coincidence.
Ava.
You touched a little bit on nationalism and fascism.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you expand and show me, explain what is the main difference between the both?
Between nationalism and fascism. So nationalism can be a part of any political theater. It's just being proud of where you're from, right? So we have, some pretty intense American nationalism here in America. That doesn't make us fascist. It just makes us, if you want my personal opinion, it makes us proud of something that we had no control over. But that's just me. That's just me that thinks things like that. It's just being proud of where you're from. It's I guess not only being proud of it, but using that pride to sort of sometimes it can lead to safeguarding yourself from things that are foreign to you, which I find to be problematic. But that's what nationalism is. But nationalism and fascism go well together. Nationalism and communism go well together, and nationalism and capitalism go well together. There's a right and a wrong amount of nationalism, right? You could be proud of where you're from in the idea of taking care of your country. But when it turns into hate for things that aren't of your country, that's when there's a problem. But that's what nationalism is. Ms. Cummins.
There was a slide where it had maps on it and it was yellow and there was red.
Yes.
Could you just explain that slide a little bit?
Yeah, in fact, I'll go to it. Hold on. Let me... So this shows the dominion of the Habsburg Empire. So the Habsburgs were German descendant rulers. They were royalty. If you ever heard of the Holy Roman Empire, they were who reigned there. But they did have relatives that took over Portugal and Spain, parts of Italy. But they were this Germanic family of rulers that just through marriage would take over different places all around Europe. And so that's why he would hearken back to these guys, because they ruled over so much territory. These were the incest guys. But they had a lot of power. And so that's where this is showing. So, Germany is like right here. Also, you'll see Poland here. I know I said that Treaty of Versailles granted Polish independence, and that's true. for like 200 years, Poland didn't exist. They just existed as a people. And this is before that time, 1700. So that's interesting. I wanted to point that out. That's interesting. I can't remember exactly what caused them not to exist anymore. Kate.
So, you discussed when exactly the German military lost faith in Hitler.
Yes,
When did the people lose faith? Like just
that's a good question.
the civilians.
So the civilians were a lot more indoctrinated than the military in a lot of ways, at least after the war started. So once the war started, the military is out in the world, they're fighting, they're going through hell, but the people are still being exposed to propaganda. They're in schools that are teaching that Hitler is, the savior of this nation. Have you ever heard of the Hitler Youth? And they're still there, but they are getting bombed. They're getting bombed into oblivion by the Allied forces. But the people really started losing faith, I would say, after the Normandy landing. Now, this is just kind of my own. I haven't looked into that as much as I should have, but that's when I would think that it probably started happening. So after the Normandy landing, which is actually right about there. So this happened in 1944, and a year later, Germany surrendered. So from the Normandy landing on, the Allies are just pushing into Germany, further and further. The Russians are coming from the east, pushing into Germany, and the people know it's coming. There's a book called A Girl in Berlin. It is hardcore for anyone who actually wants to read that. It's about the Russian rape of women in Berlin. But they knew that was coming. But there was nothing they could really do. There was nowhere they could go. They were trapped. And so I would say that the Normandy landing is when people are like, okay, things are getting a little real. Things are coming our way now. We can't really get out. But faith in Hitler would have eroded to them. But there were fanatics that they never lost faith. And these fanatics are the people that were in power, that were keeping things going. So you had Goebbels and Goering, and then these just the propaganda people. Propaganda minister was Goebbels. That guy actually, him and his wife were in the bunker with Hitler in Berlin. His wife poisoned their 5 children, who all had names that started with H, 4 or 5. Killed them and then killed themselves before Hitler killed himself. So, fanatics to the highest degree. Williams.
Yeah, quick, I guess, back to the us versus them thing.
Yes.
I mean, it builds a lot on the us versus them on the back of the isolation and eventually concentration of political enemies, because
Yes.
the first concentration camp starts in like a month or so after he actually takes power, with the ability to move political prisoners and move any dissidents out of the society. So I just, as a historian, that's a little bit of addition to the us versus them, is the them is somebody that you can, as soon as you identify them as them, then it becomes okay to get rid of them, is kind of where the us versus them goes with it. And so I think to me
Yes.
that's a little bit of extra stuff for that point.
I actually had it in here. I had a little thing that I'd written. A cause for and a solution to all your problems. Right? Cookie.
Oh, sorry. Were you still talking?
No. Go ahead.
So I just wasn't aware of the coup situation, and so I just wanted to ask about that back in the 20s. Is that right?
23, yes, ma'am.
So I just didn't know about this. So Hitler tried to take power at that point from the Weimar Republic. Is that right?
Yes.
And then went to jail for, it was supposed to be 5 years, it was 9 months. And then got incorporated into what government?
Okay,
when he
so-
started rising to power. I was just confused by how do you go from being in prison for treason to being in power of the country, in control of the country? How did
Right, that's fair. So with the publication of Mein Kampf and his public trial, people were now starting to get endeared to him. They wanted to see where things would go with him. And it wasn't a majority at first, but it was enough to get the Nazis seats on the government council, essentially. And this was in Berlin. So after a few years, they're getting more and more votes every time an election comes up, and eventually they did have the majority. The one guy that was kind of in their way would be von Hindenburg, President von Hindenburg, who was a World War I hero. But when he died, they gave Hitler, full power. So it wasn't necessarily him that got incorporated, it was the Nazis, and he was the leader of the Nazis. And so the Nazis put him in place. It wasn't people. But people still loved him.
Okay, thanks.
Tricky?
So I got a quick question and then a longer one. So,
Okay.
So earlier when you were talking about the fascism, you described it as a far right movement,
Yes.
right? So that term far right, does that term mean the same thing then and there as it does here? Or is there a distinction between what we would refer to as far right in America versus far right in Germany?
I would translate it into like ultra conservative. It was they wanted to restore a natural order. It's a little more hardcore there than it is here in modern times anyway. But a little more, it's very conservative. They wanted to keep this aristocracy, this control by the elites. But these elites were all chosen by the Nazis. They weren't people that were already in power. And it was a lot of it was like a monetary thing. They wanted to control the money and not have to spend all their money. They didn't want there to be, so with communism, it's everyone gets a handout kind of thing. They didn't want it to be like that. Not among a certain echelon of society anyway. So that's kind of where I'm at with the far right thing. What was you said you had another question?
Yeah, I have a long one. So at the very end, your assessment, right?
Yes.
You talked about how if we don't, we can see this kind of rhetoric now if we look hard enough, right? So on. I don't think you have to look very hard at all, actually. But fair point. So here's my question: in our age of like rampant conspiracy theories, that I wouldn't say unchecked, but like stubborn ones, right? Which conspiracy theories tend to be anyway. They're like impossible to argue against. Partly because of social media, right? So in this age of these conspiracy theories and social media, is it even possible to stop this kind of thing from happening again? I mean, is it possible to, like, in a kind of ideological way to stop this from happening? Does that make sense?
That does, yes. The only way that I could say that I think would for sure stop that would be a more widespread and more sophisticated form of education. So learning about all of this stuff can make you'll have more awareness whenever you see something like this. You'll be like, oh, that reminds me of that thing. But, people that don't have any kind of decent education. So like for me, for example, I'm 30. I'm not a traditional college student. If I was 18, I wouldn't know any of this. I wouldn't know what to look for. I wouldn't know what was happening. I started studying history after high school. My history teacher in high school was not a good history teacher. I had no interest in it. I didn't like it. But this is kind of what got me into studying history is I wanted to know how this happened, how the Holocaust and how World War II happened. So when I say education, it doesn't have to be necessarily done through some sort of government system or some sort of school system. You can do it on your own, especially today, which is what I hope to inspire people to do with this presentation. But if we are giving a good foundation through government programs or through a better school system, that would be the first step in fighting, the rise of a fascist or, just dangerous in general oligarchy or leadership of a nation that can manipulate everybody into doing something they would never do.
I think the problem with that might be, though, that even in your presentation you pointed out how Nazi Germany had an education system.
That's true.
So, I mean, and again, in this age where you have these kind of conspiracy theories that are just kind of like wildfire, that becomes one of the conspiracies.
That's true. That's a good point, actually.
It's wrong,
If it gets to a certain point, can you fight it? Because, the schools are part of the problem now. That's a good point.
At least that's what we're told.
Yeah.
I would love to add to that for just a
Yeah,
second.
yeah.
So as Professor Trickett had pointed out, the Nazis did have schools to where they did, your primary function there is to love the Fuhrer and do whatever he wants at any personal cost to you or others, and if you didn't, you could be disappeared, not simply sent back to your mother, but gone forever. And that those students were often selected by their physical traits to represent the Übermensch, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I think in addition to that, you were talking about Goebbels earlier and his propaganda. All of that came through the radio into those common houses, into those German houses, and it was and you were required by your society to listen to those things, to be informed to it, and carry that company line, because otherwise you were disappeared. So it's that's something that I think is very, very important to consider whenever you're considering how did he engender this much loyalty, because it was too frightening not to, because of those issues. It wasn't just he plied you with flowers, he gave you the boot if you didn't. And so I think
This is true.
It's very, very important to recognize that. And that also that Goebbels said that if the radio hadn't existed, he would not have been able to do the work that he did in Germany. So I think that makes a big difference. And it takes a lot of the pressure off of Hitler to do anything correctly, because whatever he does is told the people that's the right thing. So, I think that's a really something to really consider. Also, just wanted to make this last comment. Whether you were 18 or 30 or 60 or 90, trying to make sense of all of this period and all of its complexities in any sort of comprehensive way, you did a nice job.
Thanks.
Limited amount of time to do it.
Thank you. That was a really good point. I kind of want to add to that a little bit. So if the radio hadn't existed, right? So today our radio is way more intense than just the radio.
And far less control.
So I'm gonna have to think about this a lot. How do we fight it? Yes, nameless.
She brought up a great point about fear. So I'm Lisa Winiger, I teach.
Hello.
You brought up a great point about sort of fear of the populace and the information space, the use of the information space. And I think if you sort of compare and contrast, it'd be interesting for you to compare and contrast some of the more recent wars, like what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan, that inculcation of cultures, that communication of cultures. Because there was one thing that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. experience, that we didn't see in post-World War II Germany. And that's that the people rose up against us, right? There was a counterterrorism effort, or there was a effort to counter U.S. objectives and U.S. forces once we had liberated from, these oppressive regimes. That didn't happen whenever we went into Germany, which I think, once we went into Germany and the hardcore sort of military and government leaders were eliminated, you didn't have sort of average people in the streets conducting counterterrorism operations against U.S. and other allied forces. And so back to sort of that information space, where people complying in order to survive, or were they, and had Hitler really lost the population much sooner than maybe the D-Day invasion, but they were in a survival mode, which is why we were able to so successfully rebuild them. Just sort of food for thought.
No, I like that. That makes sense. Is there any other inquiries?
We better go ahead and stop at that point. Caleb,
Oh.
excellent job. Thank you for the discussion.